Hello, in this video I want to introduce you to capital budgeting. In a nutshell, capital budgeting is the framework and the decision rules that companies use to decide how much and how to spend their capital, and so to make investments. So everything that we've really been doing in the course up until this point really leads up to this, where have been covering topics and building models of business concepts with the idea that at some point we then need to decide, is this going to be a good opportunity or is it not? And as opposed to simply sitting back and making those decisions subjectively, capital budgeting is a structured process and a structured set of rules for making those decisions. And so the learning objective in here, you'll see that, so I'm not going to read it for you. But basically, my goal here is that, first of all, you would understand the kinds of issues that firms are confronted with when they're trying to make a capital investment decision, and then be able to talk about how having a process like this capital budgeting process addresses some of those issues. So let's first talk about the investment decision in general. Consider the situation kind of commonly of a firm. They may just have one project or one idea that somebody has presented, and they're trying to evaluate, do I do that project or not? So that is a go, no-go decision. Or they may have multiple choices, and they may not be able to do all of them. And so then they have to decide, which one should I do or which two should I do? And so in order for them to make these kinds of choices consistently, they have to basically find a way to consistently describe and compare projects. Keep in mind that even if they only have one opportunity this time, they also might have had one opportunity a year ago, and they might have another opportunity a year after that. And you would like the way that you go about making the decision to be similar from time to time to time, or if you can improve on it, obviously. But so the first issue that they have is that they want to be able to compare consistently. The second issue that they might have is, what factors should I consider and compare in order to make the decision? And then the last issue is, where does riskiness fit into this? And so if you think about kind of just generally yourself and your projects, and thinking about your projects, not all of your projects are of equal risk. They may have a different uncertainty associated with whether or not the numbers you have are actually real and could actually happen, based on how much research you've done and how well you have already tested your hypotheses about your assumptions. Or it could just simply be that some of the factors that really drive the cash flows of your business are extremely uncertain, and they vary over time or they vary over situations, and you can't control that. And so you are buying into a business opportunity that inherently has these uncertainties and this potential for loss. And so you need to understand all of that. And so you need a process that sort of bubbles up to the top every time you're evaluating an idea, these risks. And so again, to recap, you would want to have a way when you're evaluating ideas, sort of a consistent way that you describe financially what the idea is and how it might work. And you want them to not only be described consistently, but you want to be able to compare them on a consistent, sort of an apples to apples basis. You then want to have some sort of a rule for helping you figure out which ones are good or not good. And you want to make sure that all of this takes into consideration the riskiness of the project. So here we are. To solve this, what many companies do is they have what they call a capital budgeting process. I will be honest with you, it varies a little bit from company to company. But the hallmark of it, these sort of big categories, these 4 steps, are pretty consistent from company to company. So the first thing that you would do is you would develop your financial forecast. Why do you do that? Because we need to take your general ideas about what the business could be like and translate it into dollars and cents. Dollars and cents are what we're going to ultimately use for making our decision. And so you have to step away from sort of concepts and dreams and wishes and get down to something more tangible. You guys have already done that. We specifically define those forecasts in terms of operating cash flows. We've covered that. We talked about relationships and assumptions being embedded in your models, and that the sources of uncertainty and any additional research that could remove that uncertainty are all parts of developing these forecasts. Again, this is a step you guys have already done. You may not have realized it was part of the capital budgeting process, but you've really already been involved in that. And it is very simply the process of taking the concept in your brain and translating it into some set of numbers or a financial model, if you will, that everybody can then see, and that you can be very explicit about how your ideas turn into dollars. The next step would be to determine capital costs. So you're going to assess and communicate the riskiness. You're going to show that to investors. You're going to get feedback from them on ways that you can either address the riskiness or not. And ultimately, you're going to come to some sense with them on if they were going to fund the project, the terms under which they would fund it, and that would determine your capital costs. And we just went through that shortly before this when you did your capital negotiations. And so you've got your model, you've sort of figured everything out, you've now gone to your investor and gotten feedback from them and gotten sense from them of the cost of capital. Now you're at this stage where you need to make a decision, all right? And this is where the capital budgeting process in the textbooks usually picks up. It ignores the first two steps, which I think is a disservice because they're quite frankly the most time-consuming and hardest part of the process. And similarly, they are the thing that gives you the real insights to help you evaluate a business or not. So that by the time that you get to calculating your decision metrics, you already pretty much have a good idea of what you're going to do. But we do want to use a consistent set of decision metrics. We use metrics in capital budgeting called net present value, or internal rate of return, or payback period. Some companies use other things along with that. We will cover that separately in this section. We'll talk about each of those. But the idea would be that with these decision metrics, that you're going to calculate a metric, and then you're going to have a rule that says based on what you get, what comes out of that calculation, the project's either a thumbs up or a thumbs down. All right? And so you can see then the next step after you calculate the metric is to actually take the decision. And so the first part of the decision is, do we do the project at all? Should we do it at all? All right? And that's really it's either a financially viable project or it's not. And then separate from that, you may wish to rank the projects in some particular way, just in case maybe you don't have enough funds or you have some other constraint that doesn't allow you to do all of them, that you can identify which ones you would prefer to do more than others. So how does these steps help? Well, so developing a financial forecast transforms the discussion from a concept to a value, which means you have removed a lot of the subjectiveness about the idea. Having the forecasts lead to something specifically defined as operating cash flows, the way that we've defined them, where they are, they don't include financing costs, they are incremental, they are after tax, all of those sorts of things that we talked about, means that you aren't subject to sort of subjectivity in how you get the dollar values. Everybody has to arrive at them the same way. And so that again adds to more consistency and less likelihood that we're not, that we're comparing two different things on two different bases. Again, as I know you guys have found out going through your process, developing the model means that you have to require You have to identify the specific relationships and assumptions that sort of drive the financial performance of your business, and those are a lot of the ahas. Or some of these are very well understood, not others not very well understood. It also really highlights for you where your uncertainties are, and then developing the forecast in a lot of times in a sort of a real world setting would point to places where you maybe don't know as much as you would like to know, or don't know it with the level of certainty you would like it. And so it guides your research in terms of market research or whatever else to find out more information, and that may modify your assumptions or at least make you more comfortable with them. And so again, gives you much more certainty about that. So all of this developing the financial forecast is really about creating a consistent picture, gaining a real understanding of how the finances work yourself, and then really identifying and researching any of the things that are really important drivers of value. So after that, then the next step is to determine capital costs. So we would assess the riskiness of the project. We would consider things as we've gone through already, where the project may be able to support more or less debt depending on whether or not the debt's going to be secured by assets and how many assets there are. So there are a lot of project-specific things that could cause the capital costs for one project to be different than for another one, even if they're from the same company. And so, quite frankly, depending on how the company goes about financing its projects and so forth, you would want to take that into consideration so that each project is sort of adjusted for its riskiness, and therefore when you start looking at value, you've taken that into consideration. The benefit of doing that, bottom line, is twofold. One, it allows you to incorporate the riskiness into the evaluation, and so you have something to show folks when they're trying to make a decision about what the range of outcomes are. Two, by going through that process in order to help your investors figure out your capital costs, you now create certainty around what that cost of capital would be. And so whereas you have already done sort of scenario analysis and sensitivity analysis and seen that capital costs make a huge difference in the value of your project, you can now remove that element of uncertainty because you know what the capital costs are going to be. Then you do the decision metrics, and again, the key here is that even when we get to the point where we've got the cash flows and the capital costs and all that sort of stuff, we still have not said, and on what basis will we decide whether we like the project or not. And so you could imagine in a room that you'd have 5 people and they would each have a different opinion about how you should pick the project. Well, financial theory tells us that some ways of making the decision are more likely to lead to value added for the business, which, if you remember at the beginning of the class, we talked about that that's really the financial goal of the business, is to grow its value. And so making the decisions in some ways have a more consistent likelihood of growing the value of the business than others. And so what we want to do is make the decisions that are consistent with the goals of the firm, and we use the decision metrics that will be consistent with that. So doing that is better than us just waiting till we get in a room and then sort of voting on how are we going to decide on the projects. If you think about it, voting on how you're going to pick the projects is really like voting on which projects, right? People that like one project better than another for whatever reason would recommend metrics that will make their project look better. And that's not a sound business practice and not something you want to do. And then the last thing is, again, actually making the selection. So as I said, there's the metrics, and most of the metrics then come with a rule, what we call a decision rule, that says, now look at the number you've calculated, and if it is this, you do the project, and if it is not this, you don't do the project. And so that is how you would make your selections. And a lot of times the Go projects are then ranked in terms of some metrics as well, using some predefined scheme. And so again, there's a benefit there of consistency. we don't just calculate the metrics, we make the decisions based on the metrics in a consistent way. And so all of that is intended to lead to us taking a lot of the subjectivity out of the investment decision, creating this objectivity, and also having a lot of documentation of what we were thinking and why we selected the projects. You'll find all of that is very useful as the projects are implemented and sort of unfold, for people to be able to go back and look and say, okay, well, is it performing the way we expected or not? If so, that's great. If not, maybe that will highlight something that we missed in terms of the way that we evaluate projects. That's something we can fix for the next time. And so over time, companies can build up a very rigorous capital budgeting process just based on the learning that they get from making selections and seeing how they turn out. Anyway, so this is just the big overview. And I realize that about half of this overview we've already done. I just want to put it in context for you so that you understand that we're really at the end. All we have left to do from a project standpoint is calculate the metrics and make the decisions. And so this module is really about how do you calculate the metrics and make the decisions. But we couldn't do that, and those wouldn't be meaningful. The metrics wouldn't be meaningful. The decisions wouldn't be meaningful if we hadn't used this rigorous process up front of analyzing and developing our forecasts and determining our costs of capital. All right, so that's really it. Hopefully that's useful.